By the time she was finished, nobody in that bank was smiling, but they were all smirking when he fired her on that miserable Friday afternoon. The condescending pity in their eyes was worse than outright laughter. It was a slow, corrosive acid eating away at the last of her dignity. Elara clutched the cardboard box to her chest, the pathetic collection of her 5 years at Sterling Regional Bank. A chipped mug, a wilting desk plant, a few worn paperbacks, and a framed photo of her and Julian, the man who was currently dismantling her life with the chilling precision of a surgeon. "It's just not working out, Elara," Julian said. His voice a smooth, practiced baritone that she used to find comforting. Now it was the sound of a closing vault door. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, a chair far too grand for a branch manager. But his father was the CEO, so such extravagances were expected. Julian's suit was tailored Italian silk, his watch a sliver of Swiss engineering that cost more than her car. He looked every bit the part of the man in charge, and he was making sure she felt every inch the part of the woman being discarded. She didn't say anything. What was there to say? She had dedicated herself to this place, to him. She had started as a teller, bright-eyed and eager, and had worked her way up to head teller. She knew every customer by name, every regulation by heart. She was the one who stayed late to balance the drawers, the one who came in on Saturdays to train new hires. She had supported Julian's rapid, almost unearned, ascent from loan officer to branch manager, believing his success was their success. How incredibly naive she had been. "Look, this is a top-tier financial institution, not a community book club," he continued, steepling his fingers. The gesture was meant to look thoughtful, but it was pure arrogance. "We're moving into a more aggressive growth phase. We need killers, people who understand high finance, not just counting bills and processing deposits." He gestured vaguely at her, at the simple blue dress she wore, as if it were evidence of her inadequacy. The most painful part was the audience. Through the glass walls of his office, she could see the other employees. There was Marcus, the loan officer who always seemed to be whispering with Julian. There was Cynthia, the wealth advisor who looked at Elara as if she were a piece of lint on a cashmere sweater. They weren't looking at her with sympathy. They were looking with a kind of predatory glee, the way a pack watches a weaker member get cast out. They were his people, not hers. She had never truly seen it until this very moment. "You're a teller, Elara," he said, and that was the phrase that would echo in her mind for days, a brand seared into her memory. "You punch numbers. You don't understand the real business of this bank." It wasn't just a dismissal of her job. It was a dismissal of her entire being. He was reducing her 5 years of loyalty, her intelligence, her very identity, to the most basic menial function he could imagine. He was telling her she was nothing. She finally found her voice, a small, trembling thing. "Julian, we have a life together. We're engaged. What does this mean for us?" She hated the pleading tone, the vulnerability she was showing him, but the shock was too immense. They lived together in an apartment he'd called temporary, until his big promotion came through. They had picked out wedding venues just last month. He sighed, a sound of profound impatience. "That's another thing. I think we need some space. I need to focus on my career, on the complexities of my future." He didn't meet her eyes. He looked at a point just over her shoulder, at the bustling city visible through his panoramic window. "My mother will help you pack your things. She'll be at the apartment this evening." His mother, Beatrice Thorndyke, a woman made of ice and old money, who had only ever looked at Elara with disdain. The thought of Beatrice rifling through her belongings, judging her clothes, her books, her entire existence, was a fresh wave of humiliation. He wasn't just breaking up with her and firing her. He was having her scoured from his life by his matriarchal attack dog. "Just leave your keys and your ID badge on the desk," he said, his tone final. He picked up his phone, already scrolling through messages, dismissing her as if she were no longer in the room. The meeting was over. Her life as she knew it was over. She placed the badge and the single key on the polished mahogany. The metal made a small, pathetic clink. It was the sound of finality. She turned, clutching her box, and walked out of his office. She didn't look at Marcus or Cynthia. She kept her eyes fixed on the front door of the bank, a beacon of escape. The walk across the marble floor felt like a mile. Every footstep echoed in the cathedral-like silence that had fallen over the branch. The smirks had been replaced by a cold, clinical observation. She was a specimen of failure under their microscopes. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the biting wind of a late autumn afternoon, the tears she had been holding back finally came. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were hot tears of rage. He hadn't just fired her. He hadn't just dumped her. He had publicly executed her, in the one place she had felt competent and secure, and he had used his power and status to make her feel worthless. You don't understand the real business of this bank. The words played over and over. He was wrong. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had no idea what she understood. And she knew, with a certainty that cut through the grief, that he would live to regret that mistake. That weekend was a blur of misery. She stayed at her best friend Chloe's apartment, a tiny walk-up that felt more like a home than her own apartment ever had. True to Julian's word, when she had gone back with Chloe to get her things, 2 of Beatrice's hired movers were already there, boxing her life into neat, impersonal containers. Beatrice herself stood by the window, arms crossed, directing the operation like a general overseeing an evacuation. She didn't speak a word to Alara, only gave her a look that said, "You were a temporary inconvenience, and now you are being removed." Chloe was a whirlwind of righteous fury. That silver-spooned, sociopathic worm. I never liked him. He has weak eyes. And his mother looks like she'd curdle milk with a single glance. Chloe paced her small living room, gesturing wildly with a bottle of cheap wine. "We are not going to just let this happen, Alara. We are going to burn his life to the ground." Metaphorically, of course. Mostly. Alara just sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, feeling hollowed out. The anger from Friday had subsided, leaving behind a deep, aching grief. How had she been so blind? The signs had all been there. The way Julian would talk about his family's legacy, the Thorndyke name, as if it were a royal lineage. The way he would dismiss her opinions on finance, patting her on the head and saying, "Leave the big picture to me, honey." The way he had insisted on keeping their finances completely separate, even after they got engaged, framing it as a modern approach when it was really about control. She had wanted to be loved for herself, not for what she might one day represent. It was a foolish, romantic notion, and it had cost her everything. She thought back to her grandfather, Arthur Vance. He was the one who had founded Sterling Regional Bank decades ago, building it from a single small-town branch into a respected institution. He was a lion of a man, with a booming laugh and a mind as sharp as a diamond. He had passed away 3 years ago, leaving the bank in the hands of his only son, Alara's uncle, a man who had all of Arthur's ambition but none of his grandfather's integrity or vision. Alara had spent her childhood in her grandfather's study. While other girls played with dolls, she learned about amortization schedules and risk assessment. He would let her sit on his knee and explain the intricate dance of capital and debt, of trust and liability. "Banking isn't about money, Ellie," he used to say, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "It's about character. You're not lending to a balance sheet, you're lending to a person. Never forget that." He had been wary of the Thorndykes even then. He saw them as new money, flashy and unstable. All sail and no anchor, he'd grumble after a meeting with Julian's father. They build their empires on sand, and they'll be the first to run when the tide comes in. He had made her promise to learn the business from the ground up, to start as a teller, to understand the soul of the bank before she ever thought about running it. He wanted her to earn her place, not just inherit it. And so she had. She had kept her lineage a secret from everyone, including Julian. She was Alara Vance, a quiet, competent teller. Not Alara Vance, the granddaughter of the founder and the holder of a legacy he had so carefully constructed for her. Julian thought her last name was just a coincidence, a common name. He had no idea. In his will, her grandfather had done something clever. He had left the majority of the voting shares to his son, her uncle, ensuring a smooth public transition. but he had placed a significant, controlling block of non-voting shares into a complex trust for Alara. This trust was designed like a time bomb, a dead man's switch. The shares would remain non-voting and dormant unless certain conditions were met: a hostile takeover attempt, a federal investigation, or evidence of gross mismanagement that threatened the bank's charter. If any of those triggers were pulled, the shares would instantly become class of voting stock, and control of the trust would pass directly to her. He had armed her, but he had trusted her not to use the weapon unless it was absolutely necessary. She remembered the day his lawyer had explained it to her, handing her a thick leather-bound folder. Inside was a copy of the trust, a letter from her grandfather, and his most prized possession: his original handwritten ledger from the bank's first decade. The ledger was her real inheritance. It wasn't just numbers. It contained his notes, his observations, his philosophy. In the margins, next to the names of the founding families, he had written cryptic comments. Next to the original Thorndyke commercial loan from 30 years ago, he had written a single, chilling sentence: "Their greed is a liability collateralized by arrogance. Watch the covenants." What does that mean? Alara had asked Chloe on Saturday night, her voice hoarse from crying. She had retrieved the heavy ledger from a safe deposit box that afternoon. It felt like holding a piece of her grandfather's soul. Chloe, who worked in forensic accounting, leaned over the coffee table, her eyes sharp. A covenant is a promise in a loan agreement. A borrower has to maintain certain financial conditions, or the loan can be called in. He's telling you to look at the fine print. He knew they were trouble from the start. A cold resolve began to form in Alara's chest, displacing the grief. Julian's words echoed again. "You don't understand the real business of this bank." He was about to get an education. "He's planning something big," Alara said, more to herself than to Chloe. He talked about an aggressive growth phase. He and his father have been pushing for a massive new real estate development project, Thorndyke Towers. They need the bank to finance it, but the board has been hesitant. The risk is too high. So they need to secure the votes, Chloe deduced. They need to convince the board that everything is stable. They're probably cooking the books, hiding their real financial situation to make the deal look safer than it is. And Julian needed a promotion to look more credible, Alara added, the pieces clicking into place. He needed to look like a serious player. And I was in the way. A teller fiancé doesn't fit the image. He's probably replacing me with someone more suitable. Someone from a family with a name. Her mind flashed to Cynthia, the wealth advisor, and the way she and Julian always seemed to be sharing secrets. "We need more than suspicion," Chloe said, her tone shifting from comforting friend to strategic ally. "We need proof. Hard, undeniable proof. You know the bank systems. I know how to find buried numbers. And for everything else," she pulled out her phone, "I know a guy, private investigator. He's expensive, but he's a ghost. And he's the best." The shift from victim to strategist was immediate and total. The sadness was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now fuel. Every tear she had shed was converting into anger, and that anger was clarifying into a single, sharp point of focus. She wasn't just going to expose Julian. She was going to protect her grandfather's legacy. She was going to clean the house, just as he had known she might one day have to. The private investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Donovan, was as good as Chloe had promised. He was a man of few words and immense competence. They met in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop on Sunday morning. Alara, armed with her grandfather's ledger and her intimate knowledge of the bank's internal processes, laid out her theory. Julian Thorndyke and his father are seeking a $300 million loan from Sterling Regional to fund a development project, she explained, her voice steady. "I believe they are using fraudulent asset valuations as collateral and that Julian is personally involved in manipulating the reports. He has a personal mortgage application pending with the bank as well, for a penthouse in the proposed tower. It's all connected." Donovan listened, his face unreadable. He took notes in a small black book. "What makes you think the collateral is fraudulent?" The Thorndike family's primary holding company owns several large commercial properties. Julian has been submitting inflated appraisal reports for these properties to the loan committee. I saw one of the files by accident a few months ago. The valuation seemed impossibly high for the area. At the time, I thought it was just optimistic. Now, I think it's fraud. She also told him about Cynthia, the wealth advisor. Follow him. And follow her. Donovan nodded. I'll need a retainer. And 72 hours. Chloe wrote him a check on the spot. Get it done. While Donovan worked his magic, Alara and Chloe spent the next 2 days hunched over Chloe's dining table, which was now covered in papers. Alara used her memory of the bank systems to map out exactly how Julian could be manipulating the data. She knew the loopholes, the backdoors, the ways a clever manager could override standard protocols. He's creating ghost assets, Chloe muttered on Monday evening, pointing to a flowchart Alara had drawn. He's likely using shell corporations to buy and sell the properties to each other, artificially inflating their value with each transaction. It's a classic bubble scheme. It looks great on paper, but the actual value is a fraction of what they're claiming. Alara's blood ran cold. This was worse than she had imagined. If the Thorndike Towers loan was approved based on this fraudulent collateral, and the project failed, which it almost certainly would, it would bankrupt the bank. Her grandfather's life's work would be destroyed. Her uncle, the CEO, was either complicit or criminally incompetent. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. She opened the old ledger again, her fingers tracing her grandfather's elegant script. Watch the covenants. What had he been trying to tell her? She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the notes. She found the section on the bank's founding charter, which he had helped write. She read the clauses, the dense legal language making her head spin. But then she saw it. A specific bylaw he had insisted on, Article 9, Section 4. It stated that any loan exceeding 20% of the bank's total capital reserves required a unanimous vote from the board of directors and an independent, third-party audit of the borrower's collateral, to be commissioned by the bank's chief compliance officer. It was an emergency brake, a safeguard against exactly this kind of reckless gamble. Chloe, look at this, she whispered, her heart pounding. The chief compliance officer is a man named David Chun. He's been with the bank for 40 years. He was my grandfather's right-hand man. He's unimpeachable. So Julian and his father would have to bypass him, Chloe said, or forge his report. They wouldn't dare forge it. Chun keeps meticulous records, but maybe they're hoping to rush the vote through before his audit is complete. Or maybe they've found a way to pressure him. Just then, Alara's phone buzzed. It was an email from Donovan. The subject line was a single word, bingo. Attached were several files. The first was a series of photographs. Julian and Cynthia leaving a high-end hotel together. Julian and Cynthia sharing an intimate dinner. Julian and Cynthia kissing in the front seat of his car. The affair was confirmed. It was a painful, personal blow, but it was also leverage. The second file was more damning. It contained documents Donovan had acquired from a source inside the city's property records office. They were the transaction histories for the properties the Thorndikes were using as collateral. Just as Chloe had suspected, it showed a rapid series of sales between multiple LLCs, all traceable back to Julian's father. The values jumped by millions with each paper transaction. It was blatant fraud. The final document was a copy of an internal email forwarded to Donovan from a disgruntled employee in the bank's IT department. The email was from Julian to his father. It read, Chun is being difficult about the audit. He's asking too many questions. We need to push the vote to Thursday before he can file his official report. I've spoken to the board members. We have the votes, assuming you can handle Sterling. The personal mortgage closing is set for next Monday. Once that's done, my position is solidified, and it will all be a formality. The name Sterling made Alara's breath catch. He was referring to Mr. Robert Sterling, the chairman of the board. He was her grandfather's oldest and dearest friend, a man in his 80s who was the moral compass of the institution. If the Thorndikes thought they could handle him, they were more foolish than she could have possibly imagined. And then there was the final sentence. The personal mortgage closing is set for next Monday. A cold, predatory smile touched Alara's lips for the first time in days. An idea began to form, a plan so audacious, so perfectly theatrical, that it felt like something her grandfather would have dreamed up himself. "Chloe," she said, her voice low and steady, "I need you to help me draft some letters, and I need to make a phone call to Mr. Sterling." The trap was ready. All she had to do was let Julian walk into it. The next few days were a strange performance of false calm. She ignored Julian's texts, which had shifted from dismissive to slightly concerned. "Alara, where are you? My mother said you cleared out everything." "I think you're overreacting," she didn't reply. Let him worry. Let him think she was a scorned, emotional woman falling apart. His underestimation of her was his greatest weakness and her most powerful weapon. On Thursday afternoon, as the Thorndikes were likely pressuring the board, Alara was meeting with Robert Sterling in his quiet, book-lined study. Mr. Sterling was frail, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He had watched Alara grow up. He called her Ellie, just like her grandfather had. She laid out everything. The fraudulent collateral, the shell corporations, Julian's affair, the email. She showed him her grandfather's ledger and the note about the covenants. She explained the clause in the bank's charter. He listened patiently, his hands resting on a silver-headed cane. When she was finished, there was a long silence. "Arthur always said they were fools," Mr. Sterling said softly. "Ambitious fools, the most dangerous kind." He knew his own son was weak, that he would be susceptible to men like the Thorndikes. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a sad pride. "And he knew you were strong. He built a fortress for you, Ellie. And it seems the time has come to occupy it." He stood up and walked over to his desk. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning. They've moved the vote up, just as you suspected. They think they have me cornered." He picked up his phone. "I am invoking Article 9, Section 4. I am officially requesting David Chen's audit report be the first item on the agenda. And I am calling an emergency session of the Trust's Oversight Committee. It's time to activate your inheritance." On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after she had been fired, Alara received a call from Julian. His voice was smug, triumphant. "Well, I guess you heard," he said, not bothering with a hello. "The Thorndike Towers project was approved. Unanimously. The board finally saw the light." Alara's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice perfectly level. "Oh? How did that happen?" He laughed, a rich, arrogant sound. "Let's just say my father and I can be very persuasive. Chen's report was a non-issue. A few minor discrepancies, easily explained. Old men like Chen and Sterling are too conservative. They don't have the vision for the future." He paused, and she could practically hear the smirk in his voice. "Anyway, the reason I'm calling is that my personal mortgage is all set to close on Monday morning. 10 a.m. at the main branch. I know you're probably still upset, but I wanted to extend an olive branch. Maybe we can have dinner next week, talk things through. No reason we can't be civilized." He thought he had won. He was so confident in his victory that he was offering her scraps of his attention, a pathetic attempt at magnanimity. He was trying to manage her, to ensure she wouldn't cause any trouble. This was the final provocation, the last act of condescending cruelty. "I'm busy on Monday," she said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "Oh, right. I guess you're probably job hunting," he said with false sympathy. "Well, let me know if you need a reference. I could say you were a very diligent teller." "That won't be necessary, Julian," she said. "But thank you for the call. It's been very informative." She hung up before he could reply. She looked at Chloe, who had been listening on speakerphone, her eyes wide. "He has no idea," Chloe whispered. "He's walking into a public execution, and he thinks he's going to his coronation." Alara nodded. The board meeting had gone exactly as Mr. Sterling had planned. When he demanded Chen's report, Julian's father had tried to brush it aside, but Sterling had been insistent. Chen, emboldened by Sterling's support, presented his preliminary findings, which raised serious red flags about the collateral valuations. The Thorndikes, sensing trouble, had called for an immediate vote, hoping to ram it through with the support of the board members they had swayed. What they didn't know was that Mr. Sterling had already spoken to those board members privately, showing them copies of Donovan's evidence. When the vote was called, it was indeed unanimous, just as Julian had said. But it wasn't a vote to approve the loan. It was a vote of no confidence in the CEO, Julian's father. It was a vote to freeze the Thorndike loan application pending a full federal investigation. And it was a vote to activate the dormant trust, officially passing controlling interest of Sterling Regional Bank to its new director, Alara Vance. The entire thing had been kept under a strict seal of secrecy, to be announced on Monday. Monday morning arrived, bright and cold. Alara stood in front of her closet, not looking at her usual array of simple dresses. Today was different. She chose a dark gray suit, impeccably tailored. It was a suit she had bought months ago for a banking conference she never attended. It was an armor of competence and authority. She styled her hair not in its usual simple ponytail, but in a sleek, severe chignon. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the heartbroken girl from a week ago. She saw a woman she barely recognized, a woman who looked calm, powerful, and utterly in control. She saw her grandfather's granddaughter. She arrived at the main branch at 9 a.m. The employees, the same ones who had smirked at her a week ago, watched her walk in with confusion. She wasn't carrying a box this time. She was carrying a slim leather briefcase. Mr. Sterling was waiting for her by the elevators. He smiled, a genuine, proud smile. "Ready, my dear?" "I'm ready," she said. They took the private elevator up to the executive suites. The bank's legal counsel and David Chun were waiting for them in the main boardroom. The mood was tense but resolute. They spent the next hour going over the final details, signing the necessary documents that officially transferred power. At 9:55 a.m., Alara Vance was, on paper and in fact, the most powerful person in the building. At precisely 10 a.m., she stood up. "It's time." The mortgage closing was scheduled to take place in a glass-walled conference room on the main floor, the same one where so many happy families signed the papers for their new homes. It was chosen for its visibility, a stage for Julian's triumph. He was already there, seated at the head of the long table. His mother, Beatrice, was beside him, looking regal and smug. His father was there, too, looking slightly pale and shaken from the events of the board meeting, but trying to project an air of confidence. Marcus, the loan officer, was fussing with a stack of papers. They all looked up as Alara entered. Julian's smile faltered for a second, replaced by confusion. "Alara? What are you doing here?" His tone was sharp, annoyed. This was his moment, and her presence was an unwelcome intrusion. Beatrice sneered openly. "Security," she snapped at Marcus. "Remove this woman. She is no longer an employee here." Alara didn't look at them. She walked calmly to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down, placing her briefcase in front of her. Mr. Sterling, David Chun, and two lawyers from the bank's firm filed in behind her, standing like sentinels. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from celebratory to glacial. Julian's father stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "Sterling, what is the meaning of this? This is a private closing." "I'm afraid not," Mr. Sterling said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This is now an official meeting of the bank's oversight committee." Julian laughed, a strained, nervous sound. "Oversight committee? For a mortgage closing? What is this, a joke?" He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with contempt. "Did you do this? Did you come crying to Mr. Sterling with some sob story?" "I told you, Alara. It's over." Alara finally met his gaze. Her expression was neutral, devoid of the emotion he expected. It was the lack of emotion that seemed to unnerve him the most. "This isn't about us, Julian," she said, her voice even. "This is about the bank." She opened her briefcase and took out a single folder. She slid it across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Julian. "That is a copy of a private investigator's report. It details your relationship with Cynthia Lowell. It also details the fraudulent appraisals and shell corporations you and your father used to inflate the value of your collateral for the Thorndyke Towers loan application. Julian's face went white. His father stumbled back a step, looking as if he'd been struck. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp. "This is slander. It's lies," she hissed. "Is it?" Alara slid a second folder across the table. "That is David Chen's full audit report, which confirms the gross and deliberate misrepresentation of assets, an act which constitutes bank fraud." Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You have no right. You're nobody. What would you know about any of this? You're just a teller." It was the moment, the callback, the phrase that had haunted her, now delivered as his final, desperate defense. The room fell silent. Alara let the words hang in the air for a beat, letting everyone in the room, including the stunned employees watching through the glass, absorb them. Then, she replied, her voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register. "I was a teller, Julian. My grandfather wanted me to understand the business from the ground up. But he also taught me to understand the real business of this bank." She leaned forward slightly. "And as of 9:55 this morning, following a unanimous vote by the board of directors, the dormant trust of Arthur Vance has been activated. I am the majority shareholder and the new acting director of this institution." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the marble floors, thicker than the reinforced glass. It was a silence filled with the sound of a world shattering. Julian stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of utter disbelief. Beatrice had gone rigid, her carefully constructed composure cracking like porcelain. Julian's father seemed to shrink, collapsing into his chair, a defeated old man. Mr. Sterling, the neutral authority, delivered the final, simple blow. He looked at Julian's father and said, his voice resonating in the stillness, "The vote was unanimous. She's in charge." Julian finally broke. "No. No, you can't. This is my bank. My family's bank." He lunged across the table, not at Alara, but at the stack of mortgage documents, as if possessing them would make it real. But Alara was faster. She had been waiting for this. She picked up the top page, the signature page, and a thick, red pen from the desk. As he reached for it, she brought the pen down and wrote a single word across the document in large, decisive letters. "Denied." At that exact moment, two uniformed police officers, who had been waiting discreetly in the lobby, entered the conference room. They walked directly to Julian and his father. "Julian Thorndyke? Richard Thorndyke? You're under arrest on suspicion of bank fraud and conspiracy." The chaos that erupted was immediate. Julian shouted, protesting his innocence, accusing Alara of orchestrating a coup. Beatrice shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure rage and despair. Marcus, the lone officer, looked like he was about to faint. The employees outside the glass were staring, their mouths open, their earlier smirks replaced by shock and fear. Alara simply sat there, calm amidst the storm she had unleashed. She watched as Julian was handcuffed, his expensive suit now rumpled, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury. He looked at her one last time, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. But there was something else there, too. The dawning, horrific understanding of just how badly he had underestimated her. As they were led away, Beatrice, a broken woman, turned to Alara. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice trembling with venom. Alara looked at the woman who had treated her with such contempt, who had overseen the erasure of her life with such cold satisfaction. For a moment, she felt a flicker of pity. It was a small, weak flame, but it was there. "No," Alara said, her voice soft but firm. "You will." It was her only act of compassion, to not engage in a final, cruel volley. The defeat was punishment enough. After they were gone, the room was quiet again. Mr. Sterling placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Arthur would be so proud, Ellie." Alara took a deep breath, the first truly full breath she had taken in 10 days. She looked at the denied scrawled across the mortgage papers. It wasn't just a word. It was a declaration. It was the end of one life and the beginning of another. She was no longer a teller. She was the bank. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind. The news of the Thorndikes' arrest and Alara's ascendance spread through the financial district like a shockwave. It was the story of the year. The quiet teller who had toppled an empire. Her uncle was forced into a quiet, immediate retirement, disgraced by his incompetence and complicity. The board members who had initially sided with the Thorndikes fell over themselves to pledge their loyalty to her. Alara's first act as director was to call an all-staff meeting in the main lobby. She stood on the stairs where Julian had often delivered his arrogant speeches. The employees gathered below, the same faces that had watched her leave in shame. Now, they looked at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. "My name is Alara Vance," she began, her voice clear and strong, amplified by the cavernous space. "My grandfather, Arthur Vance, founded this bank on the principles of integrity, character, and service. Those principles have been forgotten. As of today, we are going to remember them." She laid out her vision, a return to responsible lending, a renewed focus on customer service, an end to the culture of arrogance and greed. She announced that David Chun would be promoted to Chief Operating Officer. She announced a full, transparent audit of all major accounts. There were no threats, no recriminations. There was only a calm, unshakable statement of a new direction. When she was finished, there was a moment of silence, and then, tentatively at first, the staff began to applaud. It wasn't the applause of sycophants. It was the applause of people who had been given a lifeline. Later that day, alone in the massive corner office that had once been her grandfather's and then her uncle's, she found a small, sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of the desk. It was addressed to her in her grandfather's familiar hand. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was short. "My dearest Ellie," it read. "If you are reading this, it means the house has become sick, and you have been called to be the cure. I am sorry to have left you with such a burden, but I knew of no one else with the strength of character to bear it. You have my mind, but more importantly, you have your mother's heart. Trust your instincts. Be fair but be firm. Remember that a bank's true foundation is not concrete and steel, but the trust of the community it serves. Build on that and you will build something that lasts. I have always been, and will always be, proud of you. Your loving grandfather, Arthur." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of gratitude and love. He had seen it all coming. He had known and he had trusted her. She placed the letter back in the envelope and put it in her briefcase. It was her new compass. The next few months were a crucible. Alara worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a relentless drive to save the institution she now commanded. With David Chun and Mr. Sterling at her side, she went through the bank's loan portfolio with a fine-toothed comb. They discovered that the Thorndike loan was just the tip of the iceberg. Her uncle had allowed a culture of cronyism to flourish, issuing risky loans to friends and powerful associates with little oversight. Alara was ruthless in her cleanup. She called in bad loans, restructured departments, and fired the executives who had been complicit in the old regime, including Marcus and Cynthia. Cynthia, stripped of her job and social standing after the affair became public, tried to sue for wrongful termination. The case was thrown out of court. Marcus, facing his own investigation for his role in the Thorndike fraud, quietly disappeared. Alara didn't just cut. She built. She reinvested in the bank's technology, making it more efficient and secure. She created a new microloan program for small local businesses, the kind of people the old regime had ignored. She started a financial literacy program for low-income families, partnering with community centers. She was putting her grandfather's philosophy into practice, proving that a bank could be both profitable and ethical. 1 year later, Alara stood in that same corner office, looking out at the city. The view was the same, but the woman looking at it was entirely different. Sterling Regional Bank had not only survived, it was thriving. The stock price had tripled. It had been named the most trusted regional bank in the state. She was no longer seen as a fluke or a novelty. She was hailed as a visionary, a prodigy in the financial world. Chloe was now her unofficial, highly paid consultant, her sharp mind a vital asset in navigating the complex world of high finance. They still had their wine nights, but now they were in Alara's spacious, light-filled penthouse, an apartment she had bought with her own hard-earned money. The Thorndikes were a distant memory, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the city. Julian had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for bank fraud. His appeals had all been denied. His father, due to his age and failing health, received a lighter sentence of house arrest and crippling financial penalties. The Thorndike family fortune was gone, wiped out by lawsuits and government seizures. Their name, once a symbol of status, was now synonymous with disgrace. Beatrice, Alara had heard, was living in a small, rented condominium in a neighboring state, having sold off her jewelry and art to pay for lawyers. She had been abandoned by her high society friends, her exile as complete as the one she had tried to impose on Alara. Alara rarely thought of them. Her life was full, her future bright. She was in the process of overseeing the construction of a new, state-of-the-art branch in a developing part of the city. The lead architect on the project was a man named Liam. He was brilliant, kind, and funny, with a quiet confidence that was the polar opposite of Julian's blustering arrogance. He was impressed by her mind and her vision, not her title or her bank account. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way Julian never had. They had started with business lunches, which had turned into long dinners, which had turned into weekends exploring the countryside. He made her laugh, a deep, genuine laugh she hadn't realized she'd been missing. With him, she wasn't Director Vance, the banking prodigy. She was just Alara. One evening, they were standing on the balcony of her penthouse, looking at the glittering city lights. Liam put his arm around her. "You seem happy," he said softly. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am. What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about the cardboard box, the wilting plant, the condescending smirks. She thought about the cold fury and the quiet planning. She thought about her grandfather's letter and the weight of his legacy. And she thought about the simple, powerful word she had scrawled in red ink. Denied. It was a denial of everything that was holding her back. A denial of the person she was supposed to be in favor of the person she was meant to become. Julian's cruel words had been intended as a cage, a definition to limit her. "You're just a teller." But she had refused the definition. She had refused the cage. She had learned the most important lesson her grandfather could ever teach her. True value is not something bestowed upon you by others, by a man, by a family, by a job title. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It is the wisdom you accumulate, the principles you refuse to compromise, and the courage to demand the respect you deserve. Some people will always try to put you in a box, to reduce you to a simple, dismissive label. The trick is to know all along that you are the one who owns the bank. She turned to Liam, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "I was just thinking," she said, "that I'm living the life I truly deserved." And as he leaned in to kiss her, under the vast, starry sky, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it was true. The suffering was finally and completely over, replaced by a peace more valuable than any fortune.